Hi guys, in this video I'm going to take you through the basics of creating an array. And it's probably best if I just get started in the project and we'll explain what an array is as we go through. So I'm going to do a new project. I'm going to select WPF application and I'm going to call this one array example. I'm just going to add a button to this project, and I think it might be handy to have a text box as well, so I'm going to add one of those. Just going to arrange my controls on the form a little bit. Notice I'm making the text box a bit bigger here than it normally is, and that's so that we can see a list of names, which is what we're going to do with this particular project. Now I better make sure I name my controls before I go too much further, so I'm going to call my button names, and I'll call its content names as well. I'm going to name my text box names, text box names. That's it for the UI. We're finished with that now, so I'm now going to go ahead and double click on that names button to create the click event. Okay, so now we're in the code view, and I'll talk a little bit about what an array is and why you might want to use one. Now, at this point in the course, you should be familiar with the idea of what a variable is. So, for example, I can do something like this. By looking at that line, we should be able to tell that we've created a variable that expects a string, that the variable name is name, and it currently has the value Dan. And that works great. And we can replace Dan with another name, and we can use it right throughout our project. The challenge for a variable, of course, is that it only stores one thing at a time. So if I want to put Fred in there, I have to effectively remove the name Dan first and replace it with Fred. There's going to be some situations where perhaps you might like a list of names and you don't want to remove anyone that's previously been in there. You just want to keep adding to your list. And that's where the idea of an array comes in handy. So in this example I've got here, I'm going to just comment out our simple variable, which just stores one name, and I'm going to show you how we could create the same thing, but as an array that could store multiple names. First of all, I have to tell the array what it's going to store, same as I do with the variable. So I'm saying here it's going to store a string. To tell it that it's actually going to be an array, not a variable, I'm going to put square brackets on the end of the string. There's a left and a right square bracket. Then I'm going to put the name of my array, same as I would for a variable. And then I'm going to create a reserved space in the computer's memory for my array. So I'm going to say equals new, and then string. And in the brackets, I've got to say how much space I want to reserve. So let's say for this example, I'd like to be able to store 3 names in my list. So what I'll do is put string, square brackets with a number 3 inside it. Then I'll finish off with a semicolon. And I've created my array. Now my array is just 3 positions in memory. It's completely empty. So I still have to go ahead and put names inside it. So let's go ahead and do that. In my click event, I'm going to go ahead and populate the array with 3 names. So I put the name of the array, then a square bracket, and then the position in the array that I want to work with. Now arrays start from a position of 0. So if I want to put the very first name, for example Dan, in the very first position in the array, I'm going to put 0 is where I want to work. So I'm going to say name 0 equals Dan, and then a semicolon. Now when I put the second name in my list for my array, I'm just going to repeat that. Names 1, in this case, equals Fred. And we've got one more space left in our array, so let's fill that now as well. Names 2 equals Sally. Okay, so now I've created an array and I've filled it with my list of names starting with Dan, remembering that the array always starts from position 0. So that's why we start 0, 1, 2, and we have a total of 3 names. What I like to do now is I like to put those names and display them in my text box. Now I could do this a number of different ways. If I didn't know any better, one way I might want to do it is as simple as this. I might put the name of the text box and the property, which is text, and say it equals, and then put the name of the array position that I like to display the name from. So in this case, I'm hoping this will come back and tell me that I've got Dan. Let's see if it works. I'll press F5 and run my program. Remember, we don't see anything until I click on the button, so I'll do that now. And sure enough, back comes Dan. So we know that Dan was stored successfully in our array at position 0. Now I could repeat that again, of course, if I want to look at what's in position 1 and position 2 in my array. But what might be nicer is if I could just get them all to come up on the text box in one go and me not have to worry about typing so many lines of code. So to do that, I'm going to use a for loop. I'll stop my program. I'll comment out that example of how to get back just one name from the list. And I'm going to go ahead and create a for loop to bring all 3 of them back. So I'm going to type for, and I'm going to press tab twice. Great thing about doing this is the for then is basically all written for me. There's only a little bit of changes I've got to do and I'm done. Let's have a bit of a closer look at what that for loop is before we get started so you can understand what it's doing. The for loop is saying to me that it's created a variable, which is an integer, called I, and it's set its default value to 0. We can see that there. That's great for us because we know the first position in our array is also 0, so that's going to be useful. The second part of the condition is that we've got I, and we're saying it's got to be less than a length. Now length has got an underscore or a red underscore on it to tell us that at the moment it doesn't understand what length is. That's the bit we actually have to fill in. We'll come back to that bit in a moment. The third bit has got an I and a plus plus. This is a sort of an abbreviated way of coding, which basically says take the value of I and add 1 to it. So each time this program loops, it's going to add 1 to I. So I starts at 0, if you remember from the first bit. After it's finished its first loop, it'll then be equal to 1, and then the second loop, it'll be equal to 2, and so on. Of course, it's going to keep looping until we tell it to stop. And how we want to tell it to stop is we want to tell it to stop when it gets to the end of our array. So here's a nifty little trick you can do in .NET that makes it very easy to do for our arrays. I'm going to take out the reference to length, and I'm going to type in the name of our array, which we call names, dot, and then simply say length. Now what that's going to do is that's basically going to go through and run through the loop only as long as it needs to read everything that's in our array. Let's see how we can actually print out the names. Remember before I did text box, so I'm going to do the same. Text box names dot text equals, and I want all 3 names to appear in the text box. I don't want them to be replaced one by the other because then I can't see if it actually works properly. So again, I'm going to use a little trick here. I'm going to use a plus equals, and then I'm going to say names, square bracket, and instead of putting in like 0, 1 or 2, I'm going to put in that variable that the for loop's using, I. And what's going to happen, of course, is when we run our loop, is I is going to be replaced with the current number of the loop, 0, 1, 2, and so on. Okay, and we'll just finish that off with a semicolon. So what I'm saying here is, effectively, loop around the length of my array, which we know is 3, because it's going 0, 1, and 2, 3 positions. And each time you go around, I want you to print out the name that you find in that position of the array. But I don't want you to overwrite the old names. So the plus and the equal sign here in our line is saying add to what's already in the text box. Don't just override it like it normally would by saying equals. The plus and equals means add it to the end. Let's see what it looks like when we run it. So I'm going to press F5. There's our window. I'm going to click on names, and there we can see Dan, Fred and Sally. Not too bad. Of course, they're all on one line, which looks a bit ordinary, so it might be nice if they were one under each other so it's easier to read. So let's make one quick change to our code to make that possible. Okay, so what we really want, and if you're old school computing, you would say, well, what we need to have is a carriage return. A carriage return simply means that we're going to force each name to appear on a new line. And we can do that in code as well. So after I say names and then in square brackets the position of the array that I want to bring back, I'm going to add another plus sign and I'm going to say environment tab there dot new line. And that's simply going to put that carriage return new line feed on the end of each of these names. Let's see how it works when we see it in the text box. So I'll run my project again, F5. There we go. And I'm going to click on the names button. And now we can see the names appear directly under each other and it's much easier to read in our list. Dan, Fred and Sally. So in this little short tutorial, we've had a look at how to actually work with an array, how to set it up, how to put some default or starting values in it with our names Dan, Fred and Sally, and then we saw how we could retrieve one value from our array just by using the reference to the name of the array and the square brackets and the position that we wanted back. Or we've also looked at how we could do a simple loop to return all the names that are in our array. Now this is actually very useful code. You'll find this really great when you come to your project, so you may want to revisit this video when it comes time to doing your Hangman project. Hope you found it useful, and feel free to ask me any questions if you can find me on the internet, I guess. Bye.